So thank you very much for coming along today. This is the TDAG meeting on tree species selection and how to get it right in a changing climate. My name is Emma Ferranti and I work in the School of Engineering at the University of Birmingham. And TDAG, the Trees and Design Action Group, is a network and a forum that brings people together to discuss and support the role of urban trees through better collaboration in planning, design, construction, management and maintenance. Evidence-based information is really important to us, and the presentations today and your thoughts really help promote cross-sector working and knowledge exchange. We would like to thank our partners for this event, which is the Institution of Highways Engineers and the Landscape Institute. Last but not least, I want to mention that thinking about the changing climate is my day job. So if you have any questions about climate change projections, where you can get data from the Met Office, please put them into the chat and I will try and respond to you. So I'd like to hand over to Phil Askew. He's our chair for today. Phil is Director of Landscape and Planning, Landscape and Placemaking at Peabody's, and is leading on the challenges of Thamesmead, one of London's largest regeneration and development projects. It has a green infrastructure and landscape-led approach called Living in the Landscape. Phil also led the design and delivery of London 2012 Olympic Park, which is the UK's largest new urban park in over a century. So without any further ado, over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you everybody for coming along. Look, I think this is such an important subject area, certainly very dear to my heart. And as Emma kindly mentioned, you know, I'm sort of involved in the work that we do at Peabody, one of Britain's and London's oldest housing associations, particularly in Thamesmead, which I'll touch upon in a minute. And of course, you know, the extraordinary privilege I had to be very closely involved in the design and delivery of the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park for the London 2012 Olympics, and as it is now, a very successful new park for London. As Emma mentioned, I've been involved particularly in a project we're doing in Thamesmead, which is a huge part of southeast London, which Peabody took over in 2014. And when I got involved about 70 years ago, I recognised that given the sheer amount of landscape we seem to be owning there, it's an incredibly valuable asset, particularly when we're thinking about climate change, biodiversity loss, and actually particularly how those will impact people's lives in our urban areas. You know, in Thamesmead, we have about 50,000 trees. And in fact, yesterday we kicked off a workshop, really useful workshop to think about a strategy for how we think about those going forward in the next 30 to 50 years. In other words, you know, what's going to happen to those trees? Many of them are and may well suffer from pests and diseases and climate change. And really how those trees, not just for Thamesmead, but for Peabody and for the people who live in this part of London, how they're going to play a really important part in what makes their place cooler, what makes their place more biodiverse, what makes it actually a livable place in the future. So thinking about that, thinking about a succession plan for trees, thinking about trees for the future is really critical for the work that I'm leading, and I'm sure many others as well. As I said to our senior leadership team about 2 months ago, if we don't do anything for 30 years, we may be faced with no trees, or a very sorry state and a very different climate as well. So this is the time to think now to invest in good thinking, good science, good design, good horticulture, and plan for the future, which is very much, I think, what this discussion, this workshop, and these amazing people will help us move forward in that direction. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to our first speaker, Glenn, and welcome Glenn Corner, Natural Environment Manager at Leeds City Council, to give us a presentation about putting the discussion of tree species into a strategic context. So over to you, Glenn.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Thank you very much for that. Can you hear me all right? I'll take that as a yes.
I can hear you fine.
Thank you. So I'm Glenn Gorner. I'm Leeds City Council's natural environment manager, and I've been asked to give in Leeds and indeed the wider White Rose Community Forest that we belong to. I've developed our strategic approach since 2018. And by implementing a carbon-based tree planting strategy, I'd like to introduce that to you and bring you up to speed, I guess, with progress that we've made since 2018 and indeed lessons that we've learned. I think back in 2018, we were very, very conscious, of course, that the ask of national government, which was developing at that time to increase tree canopy cover to assist with climate change adaptation, was really big. And for us, particularly in Leeds, it was a rather large challenge because we were looking at not just urban trees, but also woodland creation in both rural and peri-urban areas. Leeds is quite a large unitary authority. It's 535 square kilometres in total. And looking at the ask, there were a number of things that we really needed to take into account, such as national policy. I mean, back in 2019, the Climate Change Committee were very clear, I guess, that the policies, the national policies, needed to be clearer, more stable and better designed. We needed to understand, of course, as we moved away from the Common Agricultural Policy and transitioned to Environmental Land Management Scheme, there needed to be clearer context there as well. And to date, I guess, we'd have to say that we're still no nearer really to understanding what the full package that the ELMS will deliver for us. The ambition nationally for 21-20 to 25 was to create 30,000 hectares in the UK, 1/3 of that in England. And from 2026 to 2050, raise that to 30,000 hectares per year. And this was absolutely massive. And when you consider that back in 2019-20, only 2,330 hectares had been created in England and only 14,500 for the UK as a whole. We also realised there had to be some balance in this because it wasn't just about capturing carbon, although that's where we focused initially. There are big issues with biodiversity, farming, landscape character, water quality, for example. So as we approached this, we realised that clearly people were beginning to really appreciate that trees had a role to play and that increases in canopy cover would be quite important. But it felt at the time that lots and lots of new people had an opinion and had a view, and we felt that really this enthusiasm needed to be harnessed in a more strategic way. Going back to the strategy, our own...
Glenn, it's Emma. Can I just ask if you can just switch into screen sharing mode, please? I'm sorry to disrupt you mid-flow.
Not the screen.
No, we can see. Have another go.
Can you not see any of those slides?
We could see your slides, but we could see them without. Try and share again.
I don't think it'll let me share again. So just let me go back into.
So hang on.
Okay.
I'm sorry to disrupt the seminar. Hang on.
Our journey in developing a strategic approach was based basically on green infrastructure. And way back in 2008, the concept of green infrastructure was emerging quite quickly. And indeed, in 2010, we joined forces with other colleagues throughout the then Leeds City region to map the strategic green infrastructure throughout the Leeds City region. And the first slide that you can see to the top left is the result of that, which mapped 9 green infrastructure strategic corridors through Leeds. The bottom slide shows how we interpreted that in our own core strategy, and the purple shaded area is represented top right on a more local level, where we started to look at how we might connect landscapes together. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, in terms of connecting landscape, this slide illustrates some of the maybe not challenges, but some quick wins that we had. So in reality, the skyline shows an 18th century capability brown landscape, which is Temple Newsome House. And coming forwards, we've got a 1970s post-industrial landscape, which is former mineral extraction. And in the foreground, year 2000 post-industrial landscape, which is actually a colliery spoil heap. But in many respects, you can see how those landscapes can, with forethought and good planning, can actually come together. Next slide, please, sir. We also need to remember and remind our enthused colleagues that trees need soil. Each of the slides that you see on this image are trees that are planted into hard-built landscape, and they're in crate systems. Some are silver cells and some are green blue urban products as well. The tree on the bottom right was the one that started this journey off for Leeds, and that's in Leeds city centre. And that tree, which is absolutely thriving today, was planted in 2013 into 28 cubic meters of soil set in silver cells. That set the standard for urban tree planting in Leeds' hard-built environment. Next slide, please, sir. Now, in terms of where we started back in 2018, as we were appreciating the need to connect landscapes and appreciating the need that trees need soil, we didn't have sufficient baseline data on what tree canopy cover in Leeds was like. And so we worked in partnership with the University of Leeds and the charity United Bank of Carbon to actually map the tree canopy cover in Leeds. And this was based on blue sky data and also some trials that Leeds University did with iTree Eco. We actually found that tree canopy in Leeds was greater than we anticipated. It was 17.1% back in 2018. And interestingly, there was nearly a 50-50 split in canopy cover between woodland and trees outside woodland, which was most unexpected. Now, working with the university, we understood that we could split it down to wards, and there was a wide range of canopy cover across the wards, from 10% to 30%, and you will not be surprised to learn that the lowest canopy cover were in the inner city wards. Next slide, please, Sue. This work was then enlarged to include colleagues in the then White Rose Forest area, which was the 5 West Yorkshire authorities, but also some North Yorkshire authorities, Harrogate, Craven, York and Selby. And the work was based on current carbon capture and carbon emissions, carbon capture by trees and also carbon emissions by each local authority. And by scaling up the calculations that were created by the university based on a number of things, and I won't go into the detail here, but I'm happy to share links to that data to make it more easy for you to understand. But basically we worked on a principle that by scaling up tree canopy cover, we would be able to capture 50% of residual CO2 based on each authority's emissions by 2050. And as you can see from those pictures there, those images there, for Leeds in particular, that was a massive ask, because it was somewhere between 300 and 500 hectares of planting that would need to be created every year to 2050 to mitigate Leeds's CO2 emissions or residual emissions. Next slide, please, sir. The White Rose Forest now has extended even further and includes the whole of North Yorkshire and West Yorkshire. These calculations have been created for each of the enlarged authorities. That slide's a little bit out of date now because, of course, North Yorkshire is now a unitary authority and therefore just one local authority and not those numbers that you can see created there. Next slide, please, Sue. In 2021, November 2021, the White Rose Forest Action Plan for 21 to 25 was launched, And that made some large, ambitious statements based on what we'd learned from the research with the University of Leeds. So what it was actually saying was that to 2050, the White Rose Forest was aiming to increase its tree canopy cover from 11% based in 2018 to 19% by 2050, which was absolutely enormous. We were looking at over 80,000 hectares to be created between 2021 to 2050. Next slide, please, Sue. From a Leeds context, we understood that we were at 17.1%, and we understood that to capture 50% of our emissions, based on the understanding, of course, that we were going to reduce emissions appreciably to accepted levels, so we're only talking about capturing 50% of residual CO2, we would have to basically double tree canopy cover and take that to 33%. So increasing by another 9,000 hectares in Leeds. My own department, 4,000 hectares of land, which is 7% of the total that the city controlled. And we were looking to increase canopy cover on the land owned by Parks and Countryside from 39% tree canopy cover to 65% tree canopy cover in 25 years. Next slide, please, sir. And to facilitate that, Leeds created its own White Rose Forest strategy for Leeds to 2050, which actually looked at the overall need to increase tree canopy cover to 33%. And, you know, I mean, the aim by Parks and Countryside was to kickstart this process of new tree canopy cover per year on land owned by Leeds City Council and vested in Parks and Countryside, 50 hectares per year. We're into year 4 of that process, and I'll say more about that later. But that 50 hectares a year is actually a fraction of what we need to do to mitigate 50% of residual CO2 by 2050. Next slide, please, sir. To help with the process, we started a program of growing our own planting stock. These were cell-grown trees, and we were aiming to provide 222,000 trees per year for planting on land owned by Leeds City Council. That was 5.5 million trees over 25 years. Some of the trees were, a very small proportion, were being grown from seed collected by school groups and families, etc. The vast majority are all plant healthy certified and come from seed providers with the appropriate certification. Next slide, please, sir. Absolutely important that we plant the right trees in the right location, but also for the right reason. And to help this, I mean, to put it in context, I guess, really, Leeds has got 1,500 hectares of amenity woodland across the 535 square kilometres. Each year that I've worked there, for the past 30 years, we've largely averaged 30 hectares of new tree canopy cover each year. And now to go to 50 hectares of new tree canopy cover is just a massive ask and a huge increase in capacity. And so guidance has to be given to in-house teams who were charged with doing this. All of this work was to be done by staff employed by Parks and Countryside. So they needed workshops, they needed guidelines, and they needed advice on choice of species. So I created species mixtures based on 3 basic woodland planting mixes, 3 main lowland broadleaf planting mixes, which we find in Leeds based on W10, W16 and W8 NVC species mixtures. We also chose the most common wet woodland type found in Leeds, which is W6, and also had a mixture based on woodland on reclaimed land. Species choices were therefore based on NVC and ecological site classification findings. Next slide, please, Sue. To make it simple for non-specialists to actually undertake the planting and the preparation of the land, these workshops were actually quite intensive and looked at the full gambit of soil analysis, soil sampling, and preparation of land, much of it which was compacted to actually allow the planting to take place. The planting mixes were made relatively straightforward. We focused largely on 1.5 meter spacing, so woodland creation, and that was all to be done in block planting with a minimum species choice of 6 standard trees and 4 or standard tree species and 4 woody shrub species. And this was all block planting, 9 pure species blocks at 3 by 3, 1.5 meter spacings. Some of it would be very regular and some of it could be slightly irregular to meet the demands of the site. Next slide, please, Sue. Land preparation and thorough establishment management had to be made sacrosanct. It's absolutely vital that the big effort goes into actually creating that land or getting that land into a situation where it will accommodate trees and you can grow them thoroughly and sustainably at scale. But you've also got to have a long-term vision of where you want to go as those woodlands increase in maturity. Next slide, please, Sue. And at the back of our minds, I guess, we're also remembering that it's not just a tree thing and that people are involved and need to be involved and engaged. And in the planting season 22-23, over 1,000 volunteers helped tree planting projects throughout that season. These were all led by rangers, and I have to say it was some of the best planting that I'd actually seen. Next slide, please, sir. Everything's design-led, and larger sites inevitably have to follow the environmental impact assessment for afforestation. And so the detail is, or the devil is in the detail, and they have to be very, very thorough and in line with national guidelines. For example, we have to follow all the breeding bird assessments and associated priority habitat assessments and future and botanical surveys as well. Next slide, please, Sue. Biodiversity net gain as green finance is also part of the agenda, and that has to feed into our strategic view and brings us into line really with improving existing woodland structure and habitats. The slide on the left hand side is ash dieback, and in that particular woodland it's about 100% death of natural regeneration. I have to say that's a planted ancient woodland site, and originally the intention as we removed the conifers was actually to recruit ash regeneration on that W8 land to create healthy native woodland. Unfortunately, we've had to revise that now and use different species to enrich the planting because the ash is just not going to go anywhere for us. Next slide, please, sir. Natural flood management is a major component of what we need to provide, and particularly within the urban environment, where it really becomes more of an engineered flood defence that we can try to naturalise. The slide, for instance, on the top left shows, if you look, see there's a new housing estate there next to a canal, and just north of the housing estate, or just up from the housing estate, is a naturalised attenuation pond. It was designed to hold just 10,000 cubic meters of water, and it was completed in December 2015. And on Boxing Day 2015, it actually worked. The river and canal combined and flooded the whole of the canal area, and the water was let into the attenuation pond, which had been planted with trees, and that saved the new housing estate from getting its feet wet. And next slide, please, sir. Larger NFM or flood defence measures have included the creation of a new reservoir on an LNR within the urban environment. So this is a ribbon of green space within the inner city area. It necessitated the building of a dam wall to engineering standards. A panel engineer was involved in the overall construction, but the site was also naturalized. So the slide you see there is the construction of the dam wall. The reservoir itself is on the left of the slide, and the soiled over part of the engineered construction is a spillway. Next slide, please, Sue. That was completed in 2019, and today it looks like this. The reservoir body itself is only required to hold water during times of flood. At other times, it's a mixture of habitats, both aquatic and dry habitats, and it has 6 ponds that are in line, which constantly maintain water. The spillway that you saw on the first slide is on the top right, and that's been naturalized as well with a variety of appropriate wildflowers. That reservoir will hold 45,000 cubic meters of water in total when it's required. Next slide, please, sir. As part of our program, we have incorporated green streets principles into capital schemes when new roads are being built or major modifications to existing infrastructure are being made. And this brings trees and suds into the process so that we can separate pedestrians and cyclists from cars, for example, and alter the flows of traffic to try and reduce emissions. Next slide, please, Sue. One major scheme that we just completed, and this was opened just the year before last, was the new Leeds orbital route, 7.5 kilometres, all built to green streets principles, which basically mean architects, ecologists, foresters, arborists are working side by side with engineers to create the design and understand the implications. So the new e-law has 17.19 hectares of green-blue infrastructure in total, of which 9.25 hectares are new tree canopy cover, and there are nearly 4,000 metres of new hedgerow. And that's functioning, working well at this moment in time. That's a great coup for us, really. Next slide, please, sir. All new planting and existing planting is mapped, both by White Rose Forest core team, but also by my own team using ArcGIS, and we can interrogate that and build on that data as we go forward. Next slide, please, sir. So what we've learned so far with the Leeds White Rose Forest strategy is that in the first 3 years, we completed 148 hectares of new tree canopy cover, which was bang on target. However, there have been some major learning curves, and I alluded earlier in my presentation to the need to bring on the enthusiasm and guide the enthusiasm of colleagues and volunteers who want to get involved. Lack of capacity in-house. There was a wish to do all of the planting in-house, but also working with volunteers. But the truth of the matter is, with diminishing resources in terms of manpower, it's not possible to do all the things that we're asked to do. So planting was completed, but essentials such as establishment management were largely ignored. And we actually suffered major failures. On some sites, we actually lost 90% plus of the planting stock. So this year, the reset has been to focus on major beat-ups and proper establishment management. And I've now been allowed to outsource that to the private sector, and we manage that contract. My team manage those contracts. And going forwards, we will increasingly outsource the whole of the operations to forestry contractors, landscape contractors, but manage that with a specialist team. We'll still be using volunteers, ranger-led volunteers, but the important thing is, if you get the establishment management wrong, you failed. You just wasted your whole operation. And the mantra, I guess, is that anybody can plant a tree, but it takes real thought and preparation to actually get it to grow and to thrive. Next slide, please, sir. We're now moving into the era where the White Rose Forest Action Plan is coming to an end, and we're moving and preparing for a White Rose Forest strategy for 2026 to 2050, and reviewing how that operates and how that will encompass a wider pool, I guess, of ecosystem services. And there will be changes to the ambition as we start to understand the real challenges of what we can do and what we can really achieve. But nonetheless, it's still got a lot of support and will hopefully meet the targets that we stated earlier. So it was a bit of a gamble. I got to put off stride a little bit with the initial failure to show my slides. And I'm very much aware that I've gone over time. But
Hi, Glenn. Don't worry. I've sort of compensated a little bit, and I think that was absolutely a fantastic presentation. And I think for me, it just shows the power of, you know, starting with data, thinking about pilots, but and all of the things you mentioned around establishment, about mapping, but primarily the ambition which you'd follow through with, I think is really absolutely fascinating. And I don't know whether we have any questions, Sue or Emma, that we want to put forward to Glenn now.
There was one I thought was interesting from Candida Diamond. Do you map ongoing tree loss targets based on existing cover, but we rarely allow for the continued loss of habitats from development?
that froze a little bit, Sue. I got, do we map for tree loss?
Sorry.
Which, yes, we do. So
do we map
tree loss is
ongoing targets are based on existing cover, but we rarely allow for the continued loss of habitats from development.
Right. Okay. Our core strategy is being refreshed, and indeed policies on green-blue infrastructure are with the government inspector now, and we're expecting to meet for a hearing in August to decide whether those refreshed policies will be approved. One of those policies includes a calculator for tree replacement ratios based on the loss of trees to facilitate needed development. The premise is that we will not agree to the removal of a healthy tree, a healthy mature tree, to facilitate a development in the first instance, and mitigation and will be the next port of call. But also ultimately we accept that if a development must go ahead, then appropriate compensation needs to be in place. And that calculator is based on the carbon capture, the carbon sequestration of a mature tree at that point in time, and then understanding how many extra heavy standards would need to be planted to meet that carbon capture at that time. And it's that is something that's with the government inspector now for approval. It's got local approval, it's got council-wide backing, but we understand that with BNG also being mandatory, there may be some difficulty of having two calculations going forwards. We want to separate urban tree replacement from BNG because we think there's a fundamental difference there.
Glenn, there are quite a few questions. I'm just wondering, some of them are a little bit detailed. Do you think you could just give people an answer in writing, and then I'll put it into the chat when we send all that out, so everybody will see the answers.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll stop peering at that.
I'll move on then next to our next speaker. Thanks, Glenn. That was, I think, just the sheer number of questions and comments I think illustrate how people are fascinated and I'm sure inspired actually by, certainly I am, by what you've just taken us through, and probably want a lot more detail. But I'm also conscious of time. So I'm going to welcome Andy Hirons, Senior Lecturer in Arboriculture at the University Centre, Myerscough, and co-author of the Teague Species Guide. to give the first of two talks, this one being on the 10 principles for tree success. So over to you, Andy.
Andy, you're muted.
Well, that's a good start, isn't it? Are you able to see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Great. Well, then I'll get started. It was great to hear that specific case in Yorkshire from Glenn there. I think over the next 15 minutes, what I'd like to do is to kind of zoom right out and talk about principles to help maximize ecosystem services from trees in urban environments. And so whilst I spend quite a lot of my time thinking about the details in life, I've tried to think about some key principles that I hope will be helpful for securing those successes, if you like. Well, obviously, there's lots of ways to cut up ecosystem services. For the most part, at least when it comes to trees, we're talking about these four, if you like, umbrella terms in terms of provisioning, regulating, cultural services, and supporting services. So, we might sometimes refer to them as benefits, but there's quite a lot of literature out there that refers to these sorts of things as ecosystem services. So it's really these sorts of attributes that I'm talking about now. Well, the first thing I think we need to really get right is to promote health and vitality of existing tree stock. It's absolutely essential that we don't just turn our attention to planting new trees and establishing young trees, but we really focus on the health and vitality and of our existing established trees, because they're the ones that, frankly, are delivering way more ecosystem services, most likely, than the younger trees that are hopefully going to provide that role in the future. So the first principle in any sort of strategy, I think, should be really geared around promoting the health and vitality of existing tree stock. And there's lots of really good options for that now, whether it be protection of trees from development sites, mitigation of soil compaction, protection from pests and pathogens. There are some options there that I think some of these things rarely get used or rarely get used to good effect. And of course, partly it's also around protecting them from development in the first place. So the second principle then, and this is obviously partly associated with species selection, is make provision for large trees. It's really, really essential to do that because, frankly, it's the large trees that are going to be most useful in the sense of ecosystem services. And that does involve intentionally designing space for large, long-lived trees in the urban realm. And that intentional design, certainly involves above ground space, but really specifically also involves the design of the rooting environment and delivering appropriate soil volumes for those large trees. That's the thing that's going to deliver a legacy planting. So principle 2 then is to make provision for large trees. And that's because, almost on any metric, ecosystem service provision goes up with tree size. Tree size really does matter. If we look at some of the research out there, Forest Research did a number of done a lot of work in this regard and produced a number of publications that are really helpful with providing that evidence base. And so here we can see, I won't go through it all, but we can see that things like carbon stored and carbon sequestered all go up with tree size. Well, that's no great surprise because, of course, carbon stored is largely an expression of the biomass of the tree. So, of course, if we're interested in carbon storage, carbon sequestration, then that all scales with tree size. If we look at other ecosystem services, such as avoided runoff here in this case, and pollution removal, again, the trends are really, really clear. So in this case, if you like, the ability to be able to predict is somewhat lower than the carbon sequestration, but the direction of travel is really, really clear. So the larger the tree, the more runoff and air pollution removal there is. And in terms of evidence for large trees, of course, we do get a taper and a flag towards the end of a tree's life. But, carbon stored, carbon sequestered, again, tree size really does matter. So the third principle then, I believe, is that we need to establish our ecosystem service priorities. Despite popular opinion or the wish of some policymakers, all trees are not equal, and you can't just have a tree that is good for ecosystem services. What you've got to do is decide on what your priorities are in relation to ecosystem services, and then select trees accordingly, depending on their different attributes. So different trees have different qualities. Decide on your priorities. And so just to sort of unpack that a little bit, we can see, well, if cooling is your major priority in terms of ecosystem services, then we know that things like crown density, or we might articulate that as a crown area or leaf area index, is important. That leads to a greater depth of shade, if you like. Crown size is important, the area of shade, and the transpiration rate. So these are all attributes that we can select for trees in relation to cooling. If we look at species, this is some work we did in Scandinavia. You can see when you look at a whole range of species, this was some work we did in Urban Arboretum. You can see that the wood and the plant area index, so that's the plant area is the leaf and the woody material, if you like, not just the leaf material, really varies drastically according to species. And so, again, if cooling is your main ecosystem service of interest, then for sure you can tailor selection to best meet those sorts of attributes. And there's lots of other work that I could have cited if we'd had more time. And the same would be applied at scale. This is just a nice little study done in Massachusetts, and you can see effectively here we have total canopy cover expressed on the x-axis, and surface temperature of the urban environment there expressed on the y-axis, and that's related to the color of the maps as well. And you can see really clearly that the increase in percentage canopy cover decreases the surface temperature. So we have really good evidence that things like tree shade, tree transpiration rates, and so on have a meaningful impact on urban heat islands and so on. And of course, I couldn't not mention the TDAG First Steps in Urban Heat that was developed by a whole series of people that are really engaged with this, Emma being one of those. So if you haven't come across that and Urban Heat is of interest to you, please do engage with that First Steps guide. It might be that flood mitigation is a really important aspect, in which case, again, we can tailor species selection to meet that desire. So large, healthy trees with dense crowns. Again, tree size really matters, as that evidence from forest research showed earlier. But also thinking about leaf phenology, whether the species is evergreen or deciduous. The volume within the tree pit itself can be really useful for holding up water as it flows into urban engineering. And of course, the rooting depth, morphology, and so on of the tree can also have a big impact on soil infiltration and if you like, how readily the ground will soak up water. When it comes to air quality regulation, tree size really does matter once again, but like if you want to get down into the detail, things like leaf surface morphology, the roughness of the leaf, the hairiness of the leaf makes a big impact. If we're talking about a planting design, having different size plants to increase turbulence is really helpful. And hopefully, again, from a design point of view, it's that behavioral change that can be taken on by the community that really also helps to deliver an improvement in air quality as people step away from, if you like, carbon intensive transport through to walking and cycling. If you're interested in biodiversity and habitat, then of course species have a role in that as well. Native is usually best for biodiversity, but there are some non-invasive, non-native species that have tremendous value because, for example, they flower at different times of year. And one of the things that we would like to do, we hope if we can get some funding to do this, is to bring a biodiversity score to the TDAG guide. So every tree species will have a biodiversity value as well. And we hope that can be something that will support your decision making in the future. Principle 4 then, quickly, we've got to minimize disservices. So things like allergenicity, but also the residual risk posed by a particular species and other disservices, it might be fruiting on a pavement or whatever it might be. That's another principle that you need to take into account if you want to maximize the, if you like, the added value of ecosystem services in terms of net gain. Principle 5 is one that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and Henrik Kwame and myself have done quite a bit of work in this area. But select trees to thrive, not just to survive. And wherever possible, we use evidence-based tree selection, and we'll be talking about the TDAG guide for tree selection a bit later in this seminar. But the key thing is really to select trees with foresight and not hindsight. What's worked historically is not necessarily what's going to work in the future. And we need to use a whole range of approaches to make sure that we select trees with foresight. And that might include using tree traits that we can, particular characteristics we can measure. It might involve species distribution modeling, as well as feedback from botanic gardens and arboreta. Principle 6 then is to diversify strategically. And I say strategically because I don't think it's good enough just to say we want a diverse population of trees. Because actually diversity doesn't always deliver resilience. You want taxonomic diversity, but within certain abiotic and biotic constraints, it seems senseless to taxonomically diversify with lots of things that are going to be sensitive to drought and heat, for example, or to taxonomically diversify with lots of things that are likely to be vulnerable to future threats, xylella or emerald ash borer or Asian longhorn beetle or whatever, take your pick. So we want to diversify, but we want to diversify strategically. And we also, as well as taxonomic diversity, we also want functional diversity. So we don't just have a range of different species, but we have a range of structures within our green spaces. So canopy trees and understory trees, things that flower at different times, things that have different leaf structures and so on, so that we get that functional diversity as well. Principle 7 then is that we really need to actively manage risks. The key ones, I think, are the risks associated with the changing climate, and species selection for sure is part of the control for managing that risk. We really need to manage the biosecurity risks, and that can be being really careful about how you procure trees for your landscape. So using only plant healthy registered nurseries, for example, and doing all you can to ensure that biosecurity is taken seriously by contractors and say those in charge of procurement. But we also want to manage the planning and policy risks that there might be to trees in the urban environment. And they may well be quite local in some cases, but obviously there's there's national policy and planning risks as well. Principle 8 then is to foster tree supply chains. It's really, really important, I think, to protect and collaborate with tree nurseries, making sure that they really understand what your requirements are, what your future requirements are going to be. In an ideal world, that you use them to contract grow exactly what you want, with projects that have got a long lead-in time. You know, plant quality, the species choices, and the biosecurity of the plants that we place into our landscapes all rely on good nurseries that are vibrant businesses. And so, you know, it's a really important principle to foster those tree supply chains. The ninth principle,
focus on equity of green space provision.
Yeah, focusing on equity of green space provision. And this is really critical that all sectors of society have access to trees, because we can never deliver the most meaningful positive impacts without ensuring that all aspects of society have access. And the 330-300 policies is a good example of something you can do practically to try and move things in that direction. But, you know, the UK Tree Equity Score is a really, really useful bit of work that helps you, you know, unwrap this principle and see how your local area or particular region is placed with regards to tree equity, and then help with the prioritization of where planting should be targeted. So that's really key. I quite like this National Geographic cover from July 2021. It shows a single road in Los Angeles and there's a collage of photographs from the, if you like, the more wealthy end of the road, and as they drive further away down exactly the same road into a less wealthy neighborhood. And you can see just really clearly from the collage of photographs that the green space is just diminishing over time. You know, we cannot be serious about delivering all the attributes and all the value that green space offers if we don't tackle this equity within our landscapes. And the 330-300 rule that was derived by Cecil Canedon-Dyke is quite good, at least in terms of, you know, prompting policy to move in the right direction. And that simply says that you should be able to see 3 trees from your home, have 30% tree canopy cover in each neighborhood, and be within 300 meters of a high quality public green space. And then finally, actually, this principle really speaks to what Glenn finished up his presentation with, and that is focus on establishment, not planting. I get hugely frustrated with planting targets. Planting targets are utterly pointless if they don't deliver trees in the landscape in the future. We have to focus on establishment. We have to make sure that funding and the way grants are delivered and the way contracts are managed focuses on establishment, not on simply sticking trees brown side down in the ground. And I think, you know, a lot of the big grants are beginning to be better at recognizing aftercare provision, but it's really, really essential that our policies focus on establishment, not on planting. And that might involve employing specialists in young trees to help support that establishment, help make sure that, as Glenn was talking about, that preparation of the site is done correctly, but also, you know, the aftercare is managed really, really well as well. And then finally, I guess I'll just finish with a figure that I use in the guidance around, you know, what those elements of establishment are. You know, tree selection is an important aspect of that, and getting the right species is clearly part of that. But getting the right plant quality from the nursery is also absolutely critical, and making sure that that quality is the same when you put it in the ground as it is when it leaves the nursery. And you know, you don't leave trees, you know, drying out in the corner for 3 months before they get planted or whatever. So that handling of the tree is important. The arboricultural practice in terms of planting and aftercare is critical, and that rooting environment. And for me, if you take any one of those elements away, then you really are struggling in terms of securing establishment. You know, they're all absolutely critical. And with that, I think my time is up, but I hope those 10 principles have been useful to get you thinking about, you know, how you might build your own policies. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. That was great. I mean, I think many of those should be more than principles or policies, but rules, actually. I think I was just reminiscing that when we were building Olympic Park, we had an absolute no go beyond 36 hours for a tree in the Olympic Park between delivery and planting, and that was an absolute given because of the things that you've talked about. But look, I think that was really great. As I say, I think they should be almost non-discussive issues in many cases. Any particular questions, Emma or Sue, that came out of that we would like to put to Andy now?
There was just one quick one from Michael Sankus. Andy, how about adding canopy spread too, so it helps with calculating soil volumes, or even add soil volumes too? I know this could be a very lengthy discussion, so you might want to actually say something in writing back to Michael, but it would be, given the interest we've all got in canopy spread, it seems quite relevant.
Is that as a guide within the overall tree selection guidance, right, to give an indication of soil volume, and that maybe
is Michael there to say yes or no?
Yes, he said yes. Yeah,
he said yes. Yeah.
You know, we do hope to deliver a revised and updated guidance for the TDAG guide. You know, in the next couple of years. Like all these things, it depends whether we can raise the money to make it worthwhile and to commit the time to it. That's basically it. But the soil volume question is a tricky one. It's certainly I can see the value in doing that. Whether or not you know, it's not always a volume thing. It's a quality thing as well as a volume thing, and it does get quite complicated. But yeah, probably now is not the time to discuss that. But yeah, it's a good point, and certainly one to think through whether we can do that in a meaningful way. Yeah, thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
In terms of the principles published anywhere, no. But I mean, I suppose we could turn them into like a TDAG first steps maybe, or
I mean, this is going to be recorded.
Yeah, we could do something like that.
Yeah, this is going to be recorded and available, and I'm assuming, Sue, Emma, that this presentation will be available for people who've come along today and who couldn't make it as well.
That's right. All presentations go on the website under past events. There is a hand raised, Phil.
Is there?
Erica, yeah. Hi, Erica.
Hi, it was just a follow-up to that question, because I was thinking it's thanks very much for that, by the way. I just thought it presented really clearly the sort of sets of, the set of principles was just really clearly presented. So if we are trying to communicate as specialists with non-specialists, I thought, well, this is fantastic. I'd love to send somebody to a web page, because you communicated it so clearly, even just in your summary slides for each principle. So I mean, no pressure, but if there was a sort of TDAG page and I could send say, have a look at this, it explains it all.
No, I can make the presentation available on the TDAG website, so that you can send a PDF of it to people you want to share the idea with. That's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the questions and everything on the chat, of which there's a lot. So moving on, we've already had two amazing presentations, I think incredibly useful. But now moving on to Kenton Rogers, Director and Co-founder of Treeconomics, who is going to talk about the importance of knowing what you have and how to use tree inventories creatively. And I can certainly speak from the work that we've been doing in Thamesmead about the value that these things have. So over to you, Kenton.
Hello, Phil. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I might turn my video off because there was problems earlier with the bandwidth, and it just means it will flow better if I do that. But I'll just say hello now, and then I'll put it back on for the questions later. Thanks for the introduction. And yes, so it's our goal really at Treeconomics to help communities, developers and municipalities to provide sustainable treescapes. And in order to do that, we work on a wide range of different projects, and that includes things like tree planting strategies and master plans. And I guess that's why I'm here talking to you today. And thanks all for coming. It's an important question. What species of trees should I plant? But it's a common question, and it's not an easy one to answer. Next slide, please, Sue. But it is an important one because, as Andy was intimating earlier, we want to create treescapes that provide benefits to people for the long-term canopy, bigger trees, providing more benefits. Next slide, please, Sue. But all too often, the gap between that aspiration and the reality is all too clear. And somehow we don't quite seem able to, these days, to replicate those wonderful street scenes that the Victorians and Edwardians provided for us. Next slide, please, Sue. So I was asked to talk about what have we got, and I'm going to go through each of these one by one. This is my short list, but if you can think of any others, please do add them to the chat. But these are all things that can help inform our decisions around species choice. And I'm going to go through them one by one quite quickly because we haven't got a lot of time. And so first, next slide, please, Sue. Experience and knowledge. And both Glenn and Andy have touched on this, but it's one of the key things we've got is, you know, what we've experienced and our knowledge base. And all the stuff that we've seen and all the stuff I'm going to show you today is a really helpful decision support, but it's not a shortcut to thinking. And when it comes to tree planting, you still need to get those basics right. Tools and guides can help you to see what tree you might want to plant for 2050 or 2090, but actually that's no good if you haven't taken consideration of local site factors, or there's no provision for establishment and maintenance of those trees, or if the soil is poor and compacted. And these basics are the subject of a lot of previous texts, webinars and workshops, or you can consult an arboriculturalist or forester or some urban forester. But planting a good tree and planting it well, that is better than doing all the work around selecting a species and then sticking it in the ground and walking away. So, you know, it's a really important point, I think. Next slide, please, Sue. So street tree inventories, these are something we work with a lot. And some of these are really, really good because they detail all the information you need, not just on risk and safety management. And they're not so good sometimes because they tell you a lot about the trees you're not going to have for very much longer because they're going to be removed. But anyway, assuming you have a half decent street tree inventory, it's a fantastic resource for identifying your current species makeup. And actually, if you have data on your tree canopy spreads as well, rather than just tree numbers, then you can start to look at the dominance of those trees in the landscape, which is really just a sum of the population in numbers and the leaf area expressed as a percentage. And that can really help you find out which trees you're over relying on in the landscape, because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and also which trees you're probably not making as much use of for whatever reason, but maybe you could be. So you can see which trees are in which proportions, and because, yeah, you don't want to keep planting more and more of the same thing. Next slide, please, Sue. You can then look at your inventory data and look at tree health and see how healthy are those trees today. So this is an example from Exeter, and we can see, okay, the red there is trees that are in a critical or dying or dead condition. And of course, we've got ash dieback. There's some oak there that aren't looking too healthy. We've got acute oak decline. Corsican pine is in that species mix and the top 10 most populous tree species. And in the southwest, at least, there's a lot of Dophystroma and needle blight. And I must admit, I've got no idea about the blackthorn. But again, it's highlighted something that needs further investigation and to go out and have a look at what might be affecting those. So once you've got a look at, you know, how healthy your treescape is today, next slide, please, Sue. You can also look at the current and potential pest and disease impacts that may be affecting those trees and the suitability of those trees. How stressed might they become in the future? Because we don't want to plant trees that can't cope with future climate, especially in towns and cities where trees will already be under much more stress and where the effects of climate change are going to be felt much more acutely. And so this is just a selection here from the 100+ species across Belfast. And the top 10 are just the top 10 trees by population. And we can see some of those aren't going to be so suitable for a 2090 climate scenario. The middle three, they're the top 3 street trees. Unfortunately, it's rather good. All those seem to be fairly well suited for the future climate as predicted by the models. And then the bottom set there are just some others that could be considered that aren't so currently well used in the tree population that maybe could be considered. Next slide, please, Sue. So that's tree inventories, and there's also free resource iTree Eco. Some of you may have heard of. There's quite a lot of cities that have done these studies, and that can tell you a bit more about the ecosystem services of the trees in your tree population, but also rather than just the street trees, it looks at the entire urban forest if you set your project up that way. And that's important because it's that wider environment that is providing public goods, and it's also the wider urban forest that's providing diversity in the treescape. Now, iTree Eco does provide a index for tree diversity, but for me, in my mind, these can be a bit difficult to sort of use or interpret. So, for example, the Shannon-Wiener index is 3.5, but actually, as a tree manager, how can I use that figure? And if you can answer that, again, please pop it in the chat. I'd be interested to hear. Next slide, please, Sue. So what we've been doing is been going back to my old forestry work and looking at the work of a chap called Hubble. This was some work he did in the 1970s on dominance and diversity of tree species. And again, I'll reflect what Andy was saying. You know, when we're talking about diversity, it is important to also consider age diversity and size diversity and intraspecies diversity, but this is just looking at species diversity. And that top line there in grey, that's the line of tree species. On the bottom x-axis, you've got the number of tree species, and then on the y-axis, going up and down, it's a logarithmic scale of dominance based on leaf area. And so that top line, that long sloping line, over 200 tree species from a tropical forest in this example. And these are just yardsticks, really. And then at the other end of the scale there on the left-hand side, you can see there's 5 or 6 little grey dots and a very steep line. And that represents 6 tree species in a temperate montane forest. What we've done here is just uploaded some of the figures from some of the citywide iTree Eco projects to look at the dominance, diversity curves for those treescapes. And for each one of those dots, you can drill down and see what tree species that is and in what proportions does it exist, how many tree numbers are there, but also how big are the canopies as well. And the inference here is, I guess, that, you know, London, Belfast and Torbay have better, inverted commas, diversity than some of the other cities and towns we've studied. And as a sort of yardstick, they're probably going to be a bit more resilient to climate change, or they've got more trees in their treescape that we can look at using in the future for tree planting. So you can see if you might want to make more use of these trees in the urban forest. Next slide, please, Sue. So having done all that with the data, I wanted to talk a bit about botanical gardens and arboretums, because they're a fantastic resource, and because here we can actually go outside armed with the data, get off our seats, get away from our screens, and look at the tree collections, which in some instances have been growing for a few hundred years. And we can observe, or we can talk to their curators, and they'll be able to tell you what is growing well and what is growing not so well in that local climate. And these trees we can then make potentially more use of in our urban plantings. And talking to some botanic gardens, that also helps them, because their grounds just simply are not big enough to conserve some of the endangered tree species either. And ideally, they could expand out into the urban environment too. Next slide, please, Sue. There are smaller towns and cities, smaller town in the southwest called Sidmouth, and just wanted to talk a little bit about community groups. So these folks wanted an arboretum and they couldn't have one because land is expensive and trees take a long time to grow once you've planted them. So they decided to declare their whole town the arboretum, and they've gone and catalogued the trees in public and private property before learning about iTree and the public-private split, and I haven't read Trees in Towns too, but they've got all these fantastic ideas, and they've now got a really good handle on the tree species in their locality, what's growing well, what's growing not so well, what they are over dependent on in their treescape, so species that they've got an over dependence on, and then others that are not so well used in their local environment. And in fact, they've got a webinar tomorrow about their story. If you're interested, I'll pop a link into the chat. Next slide, please, Sue. So I've already spoken about iTree, which is a free to use resource. And I won't speak a lot about this because I don't want to steal any of Andy's thunder, but there's the climate assessment tool from BGCI, and that gives an indication of the climate that trees are likely to experience in the future, and you can select a garden close to you. Next slide, please, Sue. And from that then, you can look at different tree species and see how suited they are to the climates that are predicted for that area in the future. Next slide, please, Sue. And then using that, you can go back to your original tree inventory and use it to look through all the trees in your street tree inventory or your urban forest sample survey and rank them for suitability. So you can look at all of that and make more informed choices about the trees you're going to plant. So I'll wrap up now. Next slide, please, Sue. In summary then, plant a good tree and plant it well. Try not to plant more of the same thing, especially if it's overrepresented in the tree population. Hedge your bets. Choose a species not just for today, but think about 2050, 2090 and diversify, because the jury is still out on the effects of climate change. You know, if the Gulf Stream turns off, we might get very cold here, not very hot. And don't forget to look around and see what's doing well and not so well in your local environment. And ever so quickly, next slide, please, Sue. If you want to hear more about iTree, there is a conference in Dundee this year, which is also being done in conjunction with Urban Relief, and which is a collection of 5 cities across Europe as part of a Horizon 2020 project. Thank you very much. And next slide. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Kenton. Can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. Yes, thank you very much, Kenton. That was really, really good. I think it really goes to into the depths of not just data, how data can be so useful, but also, frankly, just going and looking at trees, going around a botanical garden or an arboretum, especially in your local area. I was particularly inspired by Sidmouth. It sounds like an extraordinary community-led approach to trees, which I think is so important. Sue or Emma, any questions we think that came out of that, particularly now?
Just one very quick one from Suzanne Simmons, Kenton, about how should we identify a frequency of how often street tree inventories should be carried out to quantify changes over time, because they're done by local authorities mostly, aren't they? Who does the street tree inventories?
Yeah, a lot of street tree inventories are done for the context of safety and hazard, which of course is important. When we do the iTree eco projects, they recommend a 5-year survey, but the reality is if we're looking at tree species and changes over time and spending money on something which is a nice to have, not a have to have, it's more like every 10 years. But if you've got street tree inventory, if you're collecting that data anyway, it's really easy now to run that through iTree on your own database system. So you could do that every year, or just run the trees. Like I know a lot of authorities will they zone their tree survey, so they'll be collecting different data every year. So you can just build on it and do it that way instead.
Presumably for public trees, they can just update their public data whenever they do their tree inspections, can't they? Oops, lost him. Okay, so carry on.
That's interesting. That's what we do when we do our tree inspections around Peabody. We update where we do have, and in many cases we update our GIS systems, which of course are very helpful in in this particular area. So anyway, onwards and upwards. So Kenton, welcome back. Not Kenton, sorry, Andy, welcome back. You're going to give us an update now on how to use the TDAG's Tree Species Selection Guide. So over to you again.
Okay, thank you. I guess a lot of you will be familiar with this. Can you see the guide there as a PDF? Does that come through?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I thought I'd really just share what the guide is, how to go about using it. For those of you that might be familiar with it, apologies if this is teaching you stuff you already know, but hopefully for some of you it'll be useful. Really, it's the outcome of a knowledge exchange, or actually it was a green infrastructure innovation project that was funded by NERC a number of years ago. And this is one of the major outputs that Henrik and I collaborated on to provide, if you like, a guide that was freely available and as accurate and as evidence-based as we could make it. And so you can download it for free for the TDAG website. You can read about me if you want, but let's skip past that. This basically structured in the following way. We've got 3 chapters in the beginning part of the guidance around how to use the guidance or interpreting the guidance, the principles for tree selection, and enhancing ecosystem services through green infrastructure provision. And so that's actually some of those principles were formed off the back of that 3rd chapter, actually. One of the really useful things about this guide is, although it's several hundred pages long, Steve, our graphic designer, came up with a brilliant idea, although this gave him an awful lot of extra work, of making everything very much hyperlinked. So you can see wherever you see these little arrows, you can click on that. In fact, you can click on the, even that area, and it'll take you straight through to that particular chapter. And then in the top right, you can have a navigation back to the contents page. So we can go back to the contents page by clicking that. And then if you wanted to go to chapter 3, for example, we can just click on that within the contents page. So that makes navigating the document really quite efficient. So you haven't got to think, oh golly, where am I at in terms of page number and all the rest of it. But briefly then, I'll just talk through, interpreting the guidance. We decided that we wanted to give a kind of range of use potentials that would have various constraints imposed upon them. So the first use potential is park, and this pretty much includes any tree. It's, soil conditions are good, size doesn't matter, no size constraints, pretty much everything can be planted in that park scenario. Paved scenario, because we understand and we know that street trees in paved environments are more exposed to drought conditions. We have made those trees to be at least moderately tolerant to drought. So I'll come on to the environmental tolerances in a minute, but they're at least moderately tolerant. So they're moderately tolerant or tolerant to drought. And we also put, I think we took out the ones that would cause big problems with fruiting and that sort of thing as well. So that you can read about the exact specifications there. The suds trees, so these are designed, or trees that are really well suited to sustainable drainage systems. They were at least moderately tolerant to drought, because actually the substrates that they use within the pits are extremely free draining. So although you sort of think about waterlogging and flooding being really important, because they're so free draining, they also are really dry out very rapidly. So they're at least moderately tolerant to drought, and they're at least moderately tolerant to waterlogging. And then we look at small garden. Well, that's obviously got like a size constraint. The coastal trees have evidence to suggest they're tolerant to aerosol salts and high wind exposure. And then the transport corridor trees are tolerant to salt around the roots in the soil. Again, there's not brilliant scales available for that, but that's based on the literature. And then we've got a whole range of things around the tree size and crown characteristics, density. We put quite a bit of effort into describing the native environment, so you have an idea of where the trees come from. And then, much of the original research work that we did to inform the guide was around the environmental tolerance, particularly the drought tolerance. But we have tolerance according to shade and drought and waterlogging. And, I've put exactly how we've decided to allocate a species, so it's as transparent as we can make it, so that if you wanted to apply the same, if you like, tolerance scoring to your a tree species that wasn't in the guide, that you could at least know where to start looking. And we look at flowering and fruiting and leaf type and things like issues to be aware of. So that first chapter is really like a narrative of how we want you to interpret the guidance. The second chapter is around the principles of tree selection. So, I won't talk all about those because we haven't got too much time, but, there's various things that I would consider primary criteria that you really need to get right before you can worry about the secondary criteria. So you'll notice that actually the ecosystem services that a tree might provide, I put as a secondary criteria, because frankly, if the tree dies or it's not available in the nursery, it's a rather academic question. So you kind of want to make sure that the tree is somewhat available and it's got the available space and it's likely to survive in your situation before you begin to think about, what it might do for you, which is really a secondary consideration, because a dead tree is much less useful than a live tree is. And then, like we have various information on climate, the importance of like the successional status of the tree, and so on. We list like pioneer species versus late successional species, and so on. And then, as I say, we go to the third chapter. Then that's around ecosystem service provision and how we can kind of add value to that through species selection. And then we go back to the contents page. You can see I can then click through to the profiles themselves. This is a key to the profiles. So that explains the icons that we've used, and then we can go and just keep scrolling. You get to the alphabetical index, and then so once you're at the alphabetical index, you can you'll notice that you've got these little arrows. So very similar to the contents page. You can just click on a species, and it'll take you straight through to that species profile. And so you can say, well, okay, Acer campestre, there's a fundamental information on that species. We've made an effort to put the notable varieties that are available in UK nurseries there. There's a few notes and issues to be aware of if that's relevant. So you can either kind of just scroll through page by page, or you can, be more specific and go back to the alphabetical index and say, well, okay, I'm going to be interested in, the Crataegus, for example. So that's, there's about 280 odd species profiles that we provide for you with, information as consistently and as accurately as possible for you. And then at the back, we have what we call the use selector. So we have, this is the tree selector, which is kind of really a list of trees that fit certain categories. So if you're definitely got a paved site and you want to say, well, what's recommended for a paved site? We have a list of, all those trees that we've recommended that are useful for paved sites. And then again, you can click on any of these tree species and it'll take you to that relevant point in the profile section of the guide. And then if you can go back, the top right takes you back to the tree selector. So you might say, well, okay, I want to go back to use potential, have an alternative paved species and take a look at some Malus trilobata or whatever it might be. And if you're interested in the environmental tolerance, I definitely want something that is, tolerant to shade, then you can get similar lists of trees according to those categories as well. And so that's that I suppose is quite useful if if you've just got one factor. One of the limitations of working just within a PDF that works perfectly offline and not connected, and you can print it off and all the rest of it, is that you can't have multiple arguments to select trees. So what we did to sort of solve that is, just bear with me. I've lost you behind something. Where am I can't find my Zoom thing. Where's my Zoom thing gone? It's weird.
Are you looking for your shared screen?
Yeah.
Just at the very bottom, is it?
Yeah, but I can't even find Zoom. I mean, I'm obviously still talking to you, but it's... hold on. What's this? It minimized. Okay, here we are. Now we're cooking on gas. Right. So if I... so that's the sort of main PDF guide. If we then go to the guide, the supplementary guidance, again, this is available to download at exactly the same place. This allows you to kind of select by multiple criteria. So that's the supplementary database is that's just a title page. And then what we can do is say, well, let's say well, we want something to flower in early summer, because we know that is a period where there's not that many things that are flowering. And we also want to make it so that it is, say, moderately tolerant or tolerant to drought. And then that then filters, and you can obviously like have as many of those as you like to be filtered for. So that then provides quite quickly a short list of trees that might suit your scenario. Of course, you know, what we wanted to do was make things as transparent and as accessible as possible, so that as users and people that are interested in specifying trees, you've got that information. You're not relying on a nursery or somebody with, if you like, preconceptions or whatever. And yeah, this was just a way to make it, you know, give it a little bit more additional functionality. And then once you've got that shortlist, you know, you then be going back to the guidance to sort of drill down what you're interested into, and exploring those species in a little bit more detail. So I hope that was useful. Apologies to those of you that say you know, have used it extensively. I know that some, you know, is used quite widely, but I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of a talk through how we develop the guidance, and hopefully you kind of look beyond just the species profiles and some of the kind of interpretive chapters in the front matter, if you like, the front sections. And as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, you know, we're you know, really keen to make it a live document and release future editions as we get, you know, a suitable level of funding. At the moment, one of the things that I'm looking to do is to try and, let's say, integrate a biodiversity value score to those profiles, so that if you want to, you know, begin to select things that are likely to offer, you know, really good biodiversity, then that's something you could do. But, you know, watch this space. And if you're in at all a position to allocate funding, or you've got some ideas of how we might get some funding to develop a future edition, then please do let me know, or let Sue know, and we can talk about that. So thanks very much. I mean, are there any questions off the back of that?
Yes, thank you, Andy. That was fantastic. Actually, I hadn't appreciated there was the supplementary guidance, which looks like it's incredibly helpful just for sort of narrowing things down even further. But yes, Emma or Sue, any specific questions that have come up?
Yes, one from Giles Mercer. So I think this is actually a slightly different topic, but does the species selector take into account the propensity for subsidence or hard landscape direct damage? I think the answer is different to species, but I'll leave that to you, Andy.
Yeah, good question, Giles. I mean, the easy answer is no. You know, you can make some inferences around, you know, tree size and drought tolerance, in a sense, because you'd expect large trees that are drought tolerant and capable of extracting water at lower soil water potentials to you know, on high plasticity soils, to have a bigger effect than, you know, something that's small and drought sensitive, for example. So, I mean, the answer to your question, Giles, is no. But you know, there's probably some things in there that can, you know, help support your thinking, if that makes sense. Thanks, Giles. Yeah, good to see you.
Oh, but Andy, for hard landscape direct damage, are we saying consider how we plant the tree in the first place to try and avoid the direct damage?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is in root environment design, and making sure that's right, making sure the provision of soil volume is there. And, you know, it goes back to one of those sort of principles I talked about earlier in terms of, yeah, the design of the rooting environment, and of course the intentional design for large trees, you know, intentionally designing large trees into the landscape. So if you do that, then there shouldn't be any reason for serious conflicts. You're holding up something there, Sue.
I'm holding up the iStructures updating of their subsidence guidance. So right. It's actually, as we all struggled over chapter 8 on trees, I think that's probably quite a useful one when it comes to trees and subsidence. Of course, everybody, when we were doing that, it was with lots of engineers. and they kept asking us to sort of predict how tree roots might behave, and we told them we couldn't do that.
Yeah. Could nurseries be allowed to input their inventories onto Species Selector? I mean, the data's open source. You know, like all I've done in the tree selector is collate, if you like, the data fields from the profiles. You know, I guess if there's an individual nursery that's interested in using that, you know, then get in touch with me, and we'll talk about how that might be best done. You know, what I think we are interested in from TDAG's perspective is that we get good quality and consistent information going out to those that are specifying trees, because there's nothing more frustrating than getting, you know, 3 different answers from 3 different sources and so on. So, you know, I'm not saying it's perfect. It's not perfect, you know, but it's a start, and it's a, you know, it's the start of, if you like, a long-term conversation between people like myself and Henrik that are interested in the research side of species selection, and us providing, as you know, what we think is state of the art at the time of publication, and then you saying, well, we really need this, and we, you know, like we've already had the soil volume question, the biodiversity net gain, and the biodiversity question still is really live. You know, with that, you know, having information on tree growth rates, you know, would be really useful, particularly for the biodiversity net gain, some of the things you need for that. And that is all, you know, up for grabs. But, you know, TDAG is project led, you know, so we have the funding to deliver we can help deliver those sorts of projects. But we you know, we're a charity, and, you know, I basically lobby for my time not to be hoovered up by teaching, as Emma probably does, and all, you know, like we can only do so much. So yeah, please engage if you want to see things in future editions.
Thank you, Andy. So it says on my notes, feel to start general discussion. So please, could all the speakers have their cameras on, and we'll just see if there are any. I mean, my sense is that, well, look, firstly, all speakers, I think, fantastic presentations. Glenn, you know, I was so impressed by the ambition and scale of what you're doing. I think it's quite extraordinary, actually, and I suspect that there are lots of thoughts and comments, and lots of questions about how you do it and how you maintain it and how you've established trees, etc. And in fact, how you work with people as well. I got a real sense that a big challenge there, or a big opportunity, is working with other fellow professionals, collaborating, working with volunteers, using all the tools you can possibly find. Andy, you've given us 2 amazing talks. I think your 10 principles, or I'd rather think of them as 10 absolute rules, are really valuable, and lots of people have said, can we see those? And of course the presentation will be available, and I think it may be something that's worth sort of applying, or, you know, putting down on the TDAG website as well, just as a, because my sense from comments there particularly were that invaluable when you're talking to people who don't know so much about trees and planting trees. I think that's a really important thing, and I'll touch upon that in a minute from my own perspective. Kenton, great, really good presentation about tree economics and the importance of data and how powerful those can be in terms of thinking about risk, over-reliance on particular species perhaps, and of course thinking about the future, and how you may need to diversify. I thought the illustration of diversity and dominance was really interesting, and in a rather sad sort of way demonstrates how tropical forests actually have it all, but of course we're in danger of losing it all if we're not so careful. And Andy, again, coming back to the tree species selection guide and the supplementary guidance, really powerful stuff, and as you've mentioned, hopefully continuously updated as well when resources are available. I can't help thinking that in an ideal world, there'd be a phone number at the right at the end, which was yours, so people could just get in touch with you and say, well, okay, tell me which tree. But that would probably mean you do no teaching whatsoever. But I guess I sort of think that what the speakers have set out is really exciting, actually, and I think that for me is so important, because it's easy to take our trees for granted. It's easy to and I shouldn't say this, but I'm a landscape architect, but it's easy to miss when the wrong trees are specified by design teams and others, and I think intelligent clients are really, really important in thinking about these long-term approaches. But Sue and Emma, do you think there are any sort of key sort of questions or discussion points that have come out?
And I thought, well, it's actually Emma's question, but one of the TDAG ambitions is that everybody ends up talking the same language and saying the same thing, so that we don't have any confusion. So Emma did ask, and it's an interesting one, whether Glenn's tree planting groups and the tree species guide actually relate to each other.
Yes.
I was thinking it would be really good guidance, you know, if you wanted to design something for sustainable urban drainage, or if you wanted to design something for an area that you expected to be under heat stress, you know, is there sort of like a portfolio of trees that you can select that will work well? And that's sort of underpinned by Andy's guidance. And from Glenn's presentation, I sort of understand that's what you were putting out to people. It was like a group of trees that they could select and plant that would work for Leeds.
Pretty much. I mean, I was dealing with groups of people who were new to tree planting, and they'd been charged with undertaking the full scale of 50 hectares a year on Leeds City Council land, and they'd not done it before. So as a forestry arboricultural professional, I took it upon myself to create guidelines. And looking at very, very average NVC woodlands across the Leeds portfolio, I chose what I shared with you today. That was essentially W10, W16 and W8 woodlands. We do have limestone in Leeds as well. They weren't complicated. They were quite long lists that our nursery could grow species for. And the block planting that I described was based on the understanding that all of the land that we were dealing with would need subsoiling, because there was always an element of compaction. Some of that compaction would be quite serious. Some of it would be relatively modest, but it was easier to create rip lines. And the block planting just made it easier. I wasn't attracted to just putting trees anywhere. You know, there was a need to regiment it so that these people thought about what they were doing, and so they followed the rip lines, planting off the rip line but following the rip line in pure species blocks that they could choose based on the understanding of the NVC which was appropriate to that location. So there was preparatory work that had to be done first to define what that was. But part of the guidance was actually to look at what was already growing around. Because you all probably know that those three NVC types that I chose are very similar. And they do cross-fertilize. There's a lot of change. I mean, an oak is an oak is an oak, but it occurs in each of the NVC types. So it made it simple. So if someone made a mistake, it wasn't going to be death knell. The biggest problem was that as we developed, we realized that a lot of the sites that were being chosen, and I didn't choose all of the sites. I mean, my team and I, as the sort of qualified professionals, were charged with developing the large sites, which would require EIAs and would require more complex analysis and work to prepare those sites. But in many respects, other officers and workers were largely left to their own devices. And so they needed something to follow, which was simple. Now, as we developed, we realized that a lot of the sites were not going to be suitable for woodland, so we moved to standard trees outside woodland. And in fact, we did use the TDAG guidelines for that. And my premise, to make it simple again for the nursery in particular, was to follow the 10-20-30 rule. And very basic, and it's been superseded all over the world with more complex things, but it just made it easier. So we got a range of species that were going to be a little bit more robust going forwards. And as I say, the big problem for us was the lack of capacity to understand that once you'd planted, you've only just begun. And to get over the fact that that lack of capacity meant that those trees weren't being looked after. But right now, all standards have got a full 3-year irrigation regime in place, and it's been followed. And virtually 90% of all woodland creation will be outsourced to professional forestry contractors, but managed by my team. And that's what we've learned. There was a pressure and enthusiasm to do it all ourselves, but in fact, we couldn't do it, not at that scale.
I think that's such an important point, and I'm pleased that it's becoming more preeminent, the whole thing around establishment, because frankly, as you said, Glenn, it's a waste of money and time and effort, and I guess also if you're to an extent relying on volunteers or local people, it can be very dispiriting if what they've done just fails. You know, why did we do it? Type thing. I can imagine, and I think that's so important. I mean, again, going back to my Olympic experience, we had a bit of a saying: if you spend £100 on a tree, you spent £300 on what's underneath it, e.g., the ground, the preparation, thinking about soils, all the things that you're clearly thinking about as well, because that's where the real investment needs to be in ensuring that you'll get good growth.
I think Michelle's got her hand up. Michelle, what can we do for you?
That's better, I'm unmuted now. Just the whole sort of conversation about what's possible and especially what is commercially available, and also what landscape architects are specifying. So I sit on quite a few design review panels, and I also run a lecture series called Softscape Matters. And I'm hearing from a lot of landscape architects that they're being told that they have to plant or specify native only by planning authorities, and that's also coming from ecologists. And they're not properly equipped to actually argue the case, partly because anything to do with horticulture is no longer considered to be a core requirement for a landscape architect. It's actually a specialist subject and has been for about 10 to 15 years. So there's a whole army of landscape architects out there who don't have the wherewithal and the knowledge to be able to argue against planners who really aren't qualified to be dictating that sort of thing. So I think there needs to be much greater dialogue, and I'm trying to generate that between contractors, the nursery growers, and landscape architects, so that we all have a really good understanding of each other. And yes, you know, all of the TDAG documents, I say, you know, this is the information that you go to find out what can grow and what can be persuaded to grow, and also bearing in mind the changing climate. But the key thing in specifying is looking at the nursery trade catalogues and seeing what is commercially available. So, you know, there are a lot of landscape architects out there who are specifying semi-mature trees in ever increasing sizes. And yet, if you go and have a look at what's commercially available in the UK has got barely any semi-mature stock, because we've all been specifying trees, and so they have run out of trees to grow onto semi-matures. There are very few. So, you know, there's a whole thing within our industry which needs to be pulled together. And it's great what TDAG and everybody else is doing. We need to do more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I mean, just to sort of come back on that, I mean, the TDAG species list, if you like, is effectively what was available in the UK nurseries at standard size or above when we wrote the guidance. What we obviously had nurseries represented on the advisory board for the project, and what we were really keen to do was not inadvertently incentivize importing lots of weird and wonderful stuff from the continent, and with it the biosecurity risks that may or may not, but certainly may come with it. And so that we wanted to nourish the UK nursery. So that is the TDAG list is actually pretty much what is available in the UK nursery size at standard size and above. Obviously, if you're talking about semi-mature trees, that does diminish that list. But I would say unless your project absolutely needs that instant impact of a semi-mature, planting a smaller tree and making sure that it's well designed in that landscape, should be, for sure considered. You don't need to plant big trees all the time.
Well, I have to say I'm totally against planting big trees. Plants smaller the better. And I'm absolutely delighted to see that Maetaenus, however you pronounce it, Maetaenus boaria, is actually on the list.
Yes.
But, there are so many landscape architects who don't even know that that's a possibility.
I engage with nurseries all the time. I work particularly closely with Bartrams and Hilliers. And they say to me, we grow this stuff and nobody buys it. And they take all the risks. They allocate the land, the resources and everything. And then if nobody buys it, they just stop the line. There's a massive problem with people specifying things beyond the normal. And that disincentivizes nurseries to grow stuff that they want to grow, but they just haven't got a market into.
I agree. I was going to say, just as going to chip in, as a horticulturalist and a landscape architect, and I see there's some slightly controversial thoughts about landscape architects, but I do sometimes agree that on the chat, but that's fine. I won't take it personally because I started off life digging up trees in a field, so I have a reasonable understanding, I hope. But I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. I think some people obviously want to specify trees which, as Andy has just said, are difficult to get hold of, or a nursery has a go and then nobody buys the things. So I think there's a whole series of stuff that needs to happen around education, around better practice. I think you can't have landscape architects who don't know about planting and trees, or know very little, or just pick things out of a catalogue, because that's fatal. I think the issue around planting bigger trees is not necessarily driven by landscape architects, often by developers or people who want instant impact, etc. And that whole time factor is a really difficult thing for people to get their head around. After all, we want to plant a tree for it to be there longer than we're around, ideally, significantly longer. So I think there's still sadly an awful lot to do in this area.
I know. Sorry to interrupt, because I can't do a raise hand button. In Torbay, they're contract growing trees, so they're growing the trees now that they want to plant 5-10 years down the line to get them grown, so they know they'll be there ready to supply.
Yeah, and that contract growing is absolutely brilliant practice. It gives the security to the nurseries to invest in growing the trees, and you get much better quality trees out of it, because the nurseries have got that lead-in time. It should be much more widely used, and is really critical if we want resilient, secure landscapes in the future. And often you have long lead-in times with these projects, but they only think about buying the trees right at the season before planting. We
Absolutely.
need to be much better at contract growing and engaging with the nurseries. Hence that kind of fostering tree supply chains principle is really key.
I completely agree, and I think in rather sadly, perhaps. We've been, or many people have been used to going abroad to get their trees, especially if they want larger ones or particular ones. And my guess is that the nursery industry in this country has sort of suffered a bit because of that, and now perhaps because times have changed, it's not, it has to gear up for a different approach. But critically, we need the clients, the landscape architects, the people who are buying those trees to think a little bit further than one season ahead. A, because they might be very disappointed, but B, because they'll get a better product if they do that.
That's why I think landscape architects need to be properly qualified in this specialist aspect of what a landscape architect does. I mean, that is one thing that sets landscape architects apart from all other built environment professionals. And so we should excel in that. And actually, landscape architects need to know that if they go and tag trees at a nursery, it counts as CPD. They can spend a whole day going around the nursery, actually gaining a lot of knowledge, spotting trees that they've never heard of before, wonderful specimens, and it counts as CPD, even though it's benefiting a project. So anyway, I'll lower my hand.
I can't put a
Thank
hand
you.
up either.
Thank you.
But,
And
sorry,
I was going to say, I think we're coming towards the end, or do you want to say a few things? I was just going to, well, unless there are any more points we'd like to bring up in this discussion now.
Phil, can I just mention something very quickly? It's Anna.
Of course, yes.
If you want to change the skills that landscape architects have, then you have to change what you teach them. And so for engineering, we're accredited by the Joint Board of Moderators who decide what we teach the engineers. And I wondered if who tells the landscape the architects what they should be learning, because they're the people to speak to.
Well, the Landscape Institute accredits courses and accredits their curriculum, if you like. So I would suggest that's a good place to start.
Can I just say that if there are landscape architects on this call, can they get hold of their institute and tell them what they think their institute should be accrediting in terms of landscape courses?
Yes, and I've just seen Tracy saying quite correctly, President of the Landscape Institute is now Carolyn Gola, who actually is a horticulturalist, and I'm sure she'd be very interested to hear a lot of this passed back. So if I can do my job properly without people beating me up, I'm going to say thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you so much to Glenn, to Andy, and to Kenton. Really fantastic talks. I look forward to seeing the recordings as well. And over to Sue, really, to wrap up and give us any further information on news or upcoming events.
Right, so I'm going to thank you, Phil, for such great sharing. So thank you very much indeed, and for also keeping on with all the work at Peabody, because that's a great source of inspiration to a lot of us.
Thank you.
So our next seminar will be on the 21st of May from 2 to 4 p.m. British Summer Time. It's called Getting It Right for Trees on Streets and Highways. So what we've been doing as Trees and Design Action Group is we were invited to provide technical construction drawings for planting trees in highways. And these are being prepared by civic engineers. Some of you may know Stephen O'Malley at Civic. And it's supported with funding from DLUX, surprisingly or interestingly. And it's meant to be coming as a supplementary document for the reviewed manual for streets whenever that emerges, but it's actually should take out sort of any questions about how to technically do it, so that this is to give comfort to highway engineers that it can be done and done successfully, and that trees should now start being looked at by them as assets and not as liabilities. Everything about this session was recorded. We'll have the presentations on the website. I will save the chat, and then I will sort of analyze it and ask Kenton to add some answers to things that he lost during the process. So that will also go as a document on the TDAG website. And I did put into the chat about Trees, People in the Built Environment 5. This is a sort of big tree big tree conference. And this is one, given our mantra of collaboration, where just about every relevant professional institute, whether they're in the natural environment or the built environment, have actually come together and are actually presenting at this conference as to what they're doing. So that's great, but we need a diverse audience as well. So if anybody feels inclined to go to it, I think that's where everybody has a chance to talk to people across the industry or the industries and the disciplines. And that's it from me. So I think it's just thank you very much for everybody and time for tea.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thank